highly requested after doing our World War II and World War One trailers. I don't know if we actually released that one.
From Oversimplified.
From Oversimplified. We've got the Fallen of World War II. The reason we've done that, we've been asked to do World War II.
Yeah,
first,
pretty much. We've actually been requested to do the Fallen of World War II more, and I'm guessing then there is a Fallen of World War One. We already know what a catastrophe, if that's the right phrase to put it, what the wars were, and this is just highly recommended from you lovely people, and we love them recommendations.
It's good to remember what happens.
Never forget. And with Remembrance
Day coming, and do it all again.
And with Remembrance Day coming up here, it's worldwide, ain't it? So we'll stop dribbling and we'll go for it.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s, at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories. And it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts.
Tens of millions.
We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers.
It's going to take a while.
Yeah, you do actually forget about the injuries as well. Oh, I do. It's bad to say.
Over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell.
Just covering.
So about the same number of U.S. soldiers died on this single beach as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died.
That's just unthinkable.
About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe.
Good.
Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France.
That was a fight, wasn't it?
Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides. But the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium.
He was determined to win at all costs.
But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front, Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union.
Where it was very cold.
The numbers are staggering.
That is staggering.
The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition.
Yeah.
500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany. The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers.
Whoa. Didn't even realise there's that many,
Winning
actually.
the war,
I'll just quickly pause that there. What actually I find staggering about that is I always saw Adolf Hitler and the German, the whole, I don't know, the tactics of it was like, I thought he got a bit too greedy, especially later on in the war. But it was like, there it kind of shows.
A lot in one go, didn't he? Took on everyone in one go, rather.
Did, but on the Western Front, that whole part against all them countries, they literally were pretty much like for like on the German soldiers dying and American and Britain together. I was
I didn't realise Germany had that many soldiers in it.
It wasn't really, it wasn't really until Russia or they got involved. It's like, and then wow, it's like the numbers now are just ridiculously staggering, aren't they?
Yeah, because there's like 1,000 each of them, and plus injured is another 1,000, so you could double what he's showing here.
Could do. Right. I'll carry on.
came at a cost.
Cost Russia, though.
That's a lot.
I did not know it was that many. And I haven't got a clue.
It's just still going.
That's got to be in the millions now.
Well, it's when at 2 million German. Oh, this is unbelievable. I don't know.
Horrific. That's what that is. What a waste of life.
8.7 million
and
is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead. To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time.
What a force he must have been.
I don't know.
And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe.
I don't know.
It took so many countries to stop him. And so many deaths.
I'm shocked. I am actually shocked. I didn't realise it was
6
that many.
million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's not something you.
If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution.
That's kind of what we remember the most.
The second most deadly camp was Treblinka,
retold,
which was exclusively an extermination
camps
camp,
and
set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews. Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
That's hard to even look at that picture, ain't it?
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed. About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years.
They just starved, aren't they?
1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers.
I've been told about them.
The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths.
Yeah.
But most German
Very
civilian
clever
deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million. Let's step back and see where we are with the totals.
Why?
We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe.
Russia really took it.
If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million.
Shocking.
Then we have the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan. On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty. China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis.
That's hang on.
But the invasion...
That's some of their own people to think...
Ross, some. There's quite a few, ain't it?
Yeah,
So I
you
thought it was
know what I
bad
mean,
enough with the Russian diplomat doing like the... I know you can't go out there, I know you're hungry, but you're going to now put our own soldiers possibly at risk for trying to protect you. And there they are now,
Yeah.
doing that. It's just unbelievable. They didn't care for the civilians either, did they? Really?
No.
Well, they did, but they didn't.
Well, yeah, I guess they thought, yeah,
There was
sacrifice the few.
Just to save
loads a
more,
lot
I suppose.
To save the rest, but
Didn't know about that.
no.
That's
No, that's quite a different area to.
and to go.
Our history covers mostly sort of Germany and England and things like that, but a little bit of America coming in. But we're seeing quite a lot more.
Yeah, you see it in a whole
Finding
different.
it ourselves,
seeing a
which is-
different light.
China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included. More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry.
I'd really like to
Some
go
of these
back
spanned
and see
across
some of
centuries.
these now. And
I want to go on
Some of these
YouTube
are
actually.
actually,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
And it all happened
Um,
in just 6 years.
to show a light on what's happened in the past.
The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like
Yes,
this.
naturally.
That's-
Yeah.
This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking.
Yes.
Okay.
This is a very clever video. I'll just quickly add that. It's
It
cleverly
is,
done.
Yes, it's very easy to follow. Sadly,
When we turn
see
to post-war
how bad it's
conflicts,
been.
it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II.
Have we grown
Rich
up a
countries
little
have
bit?
fought poor countries, like the US
I
versus
hope so.
Iraq. But rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War
Still
II,
wars going
and they
on,
can be
yeah.
grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since.
Yeah, put together.
And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline.
Why is
Peace
it in decline?
is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long piece grows, the more significant it becomes.
It's still going.
So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
Very well
There,
done.
says it all right there, doesn't it? That was,
Yeah.
yeah, it gets quite, I wouldn't say emotional, but yeah, that is, if that's the right way of putting it, it's very
it
strong,
was, really.
very powerful. Top credit to the channel, to the people who have helped make that video. It's just it's an eye opener anyway. But that really, we knew it'd really bring it to light what kind of the numbers
I
were
had
staggering.
no expectation of how they were going to come up with it all, and that was a very clear way, without getting into lots of different complicated things, how it all added up, and it was very straightforward and eye-opening. And wow.
Yeah, and with all the suggestions for us to take a look at the fallen of World War II, this is something that even I would watch back again in another 50 years' time. You should never forget what not just soldiers, but everybody put themselves into going through that.
Just the civilians were stuck in the middle of it, and if you're a certain race or if you're a certain type of person, you were killed for that reason. It was horrific. I mean, at different times, just in this short period alone, wasn't it?
I think we need to leave that one there because, great watch. Never forget every single year.
Respect from fighting for our freedom.
Yeah, and also to the people that lived through it and are still living now through wars. Because you think about what meant the mentality of the loved ones back at home and the soldiers, the troops themselves. You see that picture? They've got like there's kids involved. I mean,
any of them over their 80s are still alive today. Or probably around 85 are going to be
80s, 90s or 100s, and it's still in their memory. So never forget. Great watch, and a big thank you to pretty much everyone that helped it turn out the way that it ended up doing. If that's the funniest way to say it, because otherwise we wouldn't be here today without them.
No.
Let us know your thoughts on this very emotional kind of episode in the comments below. Other than that, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you all soon.
Catch you on the flip side.